Hi everyone. The topic of our presentation today is environmental impact assessment. We will start with an introduction to EIA and its purposes, then we will explain the steps in the environmental impact assessment in detail. Over 40 years ago, the environmental impact assessment was introduced in the USA. EIA is the process of evaluating the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development and is used to identify the environmental, social, or economic impacts of a project prior to making decisions. In other words, it's a systematic process that examines the potential impacts of a project on the environment and identifies measures to minimize or avoid negative impacts. The emphasis of the EIA is prevention, and it is a cyclical activity with feedback. After the assessment, the results are presented in a document called the Environmental Impact Statement. The EIS must include sufficient information to ensure that all environmental, social, and economic impacts associated with the proposal have been identified and assessed, and any adverse impacts are avoided or minimized. The first purpose of EIA is helping while making decisions. While it is not a substitute for decision making, it can be considered along with other documentation related to the planned activity to help user with making decisions. EIA can also provide a framework for considering location and design issues and environmental issues in parallel. Basically, it's an aid to the formulation of development actions. Considering the environmental impacts early in the planning process can lead to more environmentally sensitive development by improving communication between the developer and the planning authority. The development actions affect many different groups in the society. EIA can be useful for engaging with stakeholders and helping those potentially affected by proposed development to be informed and involved in the planning and development process. The other purpose of the EIA is mitigating the harmful effects in advance at the planning stage to be able to manage the existing environmentally harmful developments in the best way possible.
But of course, not every single project will require an environmental impact assessment. It would be far too expensive and inefficient to conduct one for every single development in the country. So how would we decide when we need one? Unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer, as there are too many variable factors to consider. There are several rules of thumb that can help us, however. One would be that you know it when you see it. Building a new house in the suburbs may or may not need an EIA, but constructing a new diamond mine would most certainly require one. Major projects that need an EIA also tend to share a lot of similarities. They consist of features like large investments in the form of capital, a complex organizational structure, a wide range of environmental impacts, often spanning over vast areas, and a well-planned developmental life cycle. Canada even has a whole agency dedicated to conducting impact assessments on local and provincial projects across the country. A recent one would be the proposed Palladium mine near the town of Marathon, Ontario. The impact assessment on that was completed in January of this year. Now, if you've decided that a particular project requires an EIA, the next step will be to identify its scope. Scoping is meant for us to look at the bigger picture, in a sense, and examine all the possible impacts that the project could potentially have, as well as what alternative options are available. A lot may still be vague and unconfirmed at this stage, but that can also be an advantage. For example, if you're building a large factory near some rural farmland, you would have to consider what kind of runoff it could be producing in the future that could leak into the local water system or pollute the air nearby. Perhaps alternative disposal methods could be considered if the possibility of large-scale ecological damage exists. After that, you would have to consider all the alternatives to ensure that your project has the best possible development plan. You have to consider stuff like alternatives to features like location, layouts, scale, and operating conditions. Maybe the factory from the previous example can be constructed further away from farmland, or it can be designed with extra safeguards in place against pollution to offset the risk. Taking no action at all could even be an option if the current plan is considered to be better than all of the alternatives.
Once one has screened and scoped the proposed developments, the next step in the creation of the environmental impact assessment is to ascertain the actions required. First is the creation of a description of the project. The purpose of the project will be clearly defined and expanded upon. A detailed plan for the project will include all needed procedures, constructions, and materials. The project description should also include the exact location to be used, human resources needed, as well as a timeline and breakdown of all stages of development, construction, operation, and end of life. Next, a description of the environment baseline must be made. This baseline may include measurements such as current level of gases in the air, soil nutrient and pollution levels, current noise pollution, and current light pollution. Additionally, sight lines, traffic flow, and the movement patterns of local wildlife should be determined. When determining measurements to take and quantities to describe, the physical and biological dimensions should not be the only ones considered, and descriptions of economic, demographic, and social dimensions should also be procured. These dimensions may be more difficult to fully express due to their partially indirect natures. It is important to note that the baseline includes not only the current value of these variables, but also their predicted future values if the project is not implemented. To guarantee that no component of the baseline is missed, checklists, matrices, and maps should be employed. By combining the detailed description of the project and the environmental baseline, the key impacts shall be derived. Using this method, it can be determined which negative and positive environmental effects will warrant further study. These steps, like others in the environmental impact assessment process, are to be completed with input from public consultation and participation, so that small details and difficult to quantify elements may be captured.
Hello everyone, my name's Keith and I'll be doing the impact section of EIA. So what is impact? Impact is the change in the environment once a project is undertaken. These impacts can include pollution, jobs, housing, services, lifestyle, and more. Pollution is the obvious one. You have things like air pollution and environmental pollution. Jobs, sometimes when you have like construction work being done, it affects the businesses in the area. If there's a construction job going on in the area, then people are less likely to go to those areas. So that might affect some jobs, loss of jobs, especially in long-term projects. And so those are some examples of impacts. Impacts have three main components to them: impact prediction, impact evaluation, and impact mitigation. Basically, finding the issue or foreseeing the issue, thinking about those issues, and then removing those issues. That's the very basicness of impact in EIA. So, starting with prediction. So, impact prediction is identifying dimensions of change and their magnitude. Basically, trying to figure out what is going to be affected by this project. And you shouldn't forget that projects have many different stages. So For example, in a construction job, you have the construction of the project, but also you have the operation of whatever you constructed. Predictions have different aspects to them. So aspects include direct, indirect impacts, duration of the impact, speed of impact, probability of the impact occurring, and whether the impact is actually good or bad. So as you see on the right here, I made some Pokemon cards that represent different possibility of impacts. So you have air pollution here, and air pollution causes things like lung cancer and greenhouse effect, and you actually have an indirect impact, acid rain or acid deposition, that's caused by air pollution. So these are the types of things you have to consider. And now, once you predicted the impacts, you have to evaluate these impacts. So not all impacts are even that important. For example, if you have some noise, but it's not that loud, then obviously that's not that significant. So you don't have to worry about that. And maybe you have air pollution, but if it's a very small amount of air pollution, then that isn't that significant either. So when it comes to the evaluation methods, they can be simple or complex, formal, informal, qualitative, quantitative, and more. Most evaluation is simple, drawn from experts and prior experience rather than complex analyses. Now, after we have predicted impacts and now that we have evaluated impacts, we'll now move to mitigating those impacts. How do we mitigation, which is how do we reduce or remove these impacts? Some adverse impacts can be directly reduced, some of those cannot. And those that cannot have to be compensated for. And we'll see examples on the difference between impacts that can be reduced and impacts that need to be compensated for. If we can reduce an impact, then that's what we do. So an example is resiting a project somewhere where it can cause less harm to the development. For example, if you're going to build a coal mine, do it in a place that is not so close to a river so that you don't affect the water systems in the area, and you do it in a more remote location where less things are affected. But if you cannot do that, for example, you're building a highway and the main concern is noise, you can't really mitigate the actual noise itself. So you have to compensate. So in order to compensate, you build sound barriers that will block the noise from areas that you're trying to protect. So now we're going to move on to a real-life example of impact assessment. So, going from the Canadian Registry for Environmental Impact Assessments, we have this coal mine that was proposed in 2012 called the Bingay Main Coal Project. Let's look at their environmental impact statement, or at least the impact section of that. So this is the Bingay Main Coal Project. This is only the first page of their impact table. There's like 9 other pages, so this is just the first few. So we see that the table is actually quite comprehensive. It has many different attributes, columns, as you see. So the first one here is air quality, and so then the potential effect column will explain that impact, that possible impact, and then you actually see the mitigation here, and then residual effect, which is the effect after the mitigation is employed or done. And then you have a bunch of other sections that we touched on in the previous slides, which include like magnitude of the impact, the duration of the impact, frequency of the impact, reversibility of the impact, and then overall significance. And then they also have the probability that will occur in likelihood. So we see just for air quality, principal air quality constitutes emitted from site will be dust and associated metals from the mining. And then proposed mitigation is dust emissions from roads and stockpiles will be controlled through use of water sprays, etc., etc., etc. And then air quality modeling shows mitigation as proposed, and then the different concentrations of metals and magnitude with appropriate mitigation effects are considered to be minor. Duration will occur throughout the entire construction period. They're saying 2 years. Frequency, the effect is expected to be continuous through construction and operation. So they're talking about the air quality here. So air quality is going to be affected throughout the entire operation of this mine. Reversibility, they're saying it's reversible once the mine is closed, and they're saying for overall significance that it's minor. So this is just an example of an impact focus of the EIA. Even if you have a well put together EIA, it doesn't mean that your project will be approved. And in this case, public perception was really against the start of this coal mine. And we'll get into that right now with our next communication section. Thank you.
After scoping important impacts, their effects, and ways to mitigate, it is very important to communicate these impacts with the related stakeholders and receive their feedback. In this section, we will learn how effective communication is done with the stakeholders and why is it important. Effective communication is a critical component of an EIA. It allows meaningful engagement with the stakeholders and helps to ensure that their concerns are properly addressed. Effective communication is essential to ensure that all stakeholders are engaged and informed throughout the decision-making process. EIA involves multiple stakeholders such as government agencies, industries, non-profit organizations, and the general public. The general public is one of the most important stakeholders in this process because they would be the one with the most impact from any project or an activity. Now, how is this communication done? This communication is done through public participation and consultation. These are the most important components in an effective EIA. Public consultation involves seeking input from the public on a proposed project or activity, while public participation includes involving the public in the decision-making process. Some common methods used for consultation includes public meetings, public comment period, focus groups, and surveys. Surveys and public meetings are the most effective and most commonly used methods in the industry. In these public meetings, the project proponent presents an EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. It is a document that outlines the potential environmental and social impacts of a proposed project or activity, as well as potential mitigation measures. It includes a description of the proposed project or an activity, a thorough assessment of potential social and environmental impacts, an evaluation of the mitigation measures, and an analysis of alternatives to the proposed project. The stakeholders are asked to carefully consider all the impacts and raise their concerns. Now let's see what an effective EIS should consist of. It should be written in a clear and concise language. Technical language and jargon could be confusing for non-experts, so it is very important to use clear and simple language that is easily understood. Visual aids such as maps, diagrams, and charts can help to illustrate complex information and make it easier to understand. Different stakeholder groups may have different interests and concerns, so it is important to tailor messaging to address their specific needs. Listening to the stakeholders and responding to their concerns is an important part of an effective communication. It helps to build the trust and ensures that stakeholders feel heard and valued. Review and feedback. The review process helps to evaluate the environmental impact statement to ensure that it meets the regulatory requirements and address the concerns of all interested parties. The review process may result in change to the proposed project, or it may result in identification of new mitigation measures. The review process ensures that decisions are made transparently and accountably.
Once the project is complete, the next step is to evaluate the performance of the project and how well it's going to ensure that the proposed mitigation measures are implemented and that the project is operating in an environmentally responsible manner. The evaluation of the project once it's done involves monitoring its impacts to ensure that any mitigation measures are effective, identify any unforeseen drawbacks that may arise. It is basically auditing the project to see if improvements need to be made. First, we must understand how it's done. The evaluation is accomplished by establishing performance indicators, collecting data, analyzing that data, turning it into a report, and making adjustments as needed. This is an ongoing process that can be repeated in the future. Now we can get into more detail on each step of this process. The first step is to establish performance indicators. These are specific measures that are used to assess the project's progress and outcomes. Performance indicators should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Did the project meet the target? Well, first we have to collect data. Data collection involves collecting information on the project to measure the progress towards the performance indicators. Data can be collected using various methods, such as surveys, interviews, focus groups, and observations. Once data collection is complete, data is analyzed to determine whether the project is meeting its goals and objectives. This involves comparing actual performance to the performance indicators to see if the project is doing what it's intended to do, identifying areas where the project is succeeding and areas where improvements are needed, which is one of the main purposes of this stage. Once that is complete, it's time to report our findings. Creating a report for the evaluation is a very important step in the process in order to effectively communicate with what has been found. The findings of the evaluation process are communicated to stakeholders, including project managers, funders, beneficiaries. Then we must move on to reporting the results. The report should be clear, concise, and provide actionable recommendations for improving project outcomes. Finally, making adjustments is an important aspect of the monitoring and evaluation process. It allows project managers to respond to the findings of the evaluation and make changes to improve project outcomes. When a problem is identified, the first step is to identify the root cause. It's important to figure out the underlying problems. This may involve additional data collection or analysis. Once the root cause of the problem is identified, the next step is to develop a plan to address it. The plan should be specific, actionable, and have a timeline. Finally, changes to the plan should be communicated to stakeholders. This helps to ensure that everyone is aware of the changes and can adjust their activities accordingly. After that, the process of evaluation may start again. In conclusion, environmental impact assessments are an essential tool for ensuring that we build a more sustainable society. We're long past the time when we could simply just ignore the impacts of human activity on the planet. EIAs are just one part of a global collaborative effort to save the environment that sustains our survival. Thank you for your time.